Cilician Pirates. In 75 BCE, somewhere off the southern coast of Asia Minor, a Roman nobleman was traveling across the eastern Mediterranean when his vessel was intercepted by a pirate squadron. The attackers were not desperate men in broken boats. They were part of a maritime confederacy based around the rugged coastline of Cilicia, where cliffs, hidden anchorages, and narrow coves formed one of the most dangerous pirate networks in the ancient world. Their prisoner was a young Julius Caesar. At the time, he was not yet the ruler of Rome, not yet the name that would haunt senators and kings. He was a valuable hostage, and the pirates knew it. But even they failed to understand what they had captured. The Cilician Pirates operated from the mountainous shore of southern Anatolia, especially Cilicia Trachea, a coast built almost perfectly for maritime crime. Their ships could vanish into rocky inlets where larger warships could not follow. Their lookouts watched the sea from high ridges. Their raiding vessels struck merchant ships carrying grain, wine, olive oil, metal, slaves, and money, moving between Greece, Syria, Egypt, and Rome. To a merchant captain, a calm horizon in those waters meant nothing. A pirate fleet could appear from behind a headland, close the distance with oars, board in minutes, and disappear before any formal navy arrived. What made the Cilician Confederacy terrifying was not only violence, it was organization. These pirates had bases, markets, informants, ransom systems, and political connections. They did not simply steal cargo. They kidnapped magistrates, wealthy travelers, and aristocrats, then demanded payments large enough to shake entire families. Captives who could not pay were sold. Cargoes were moved through ports where officials looked away. In the chaos of Rome's wars in the eastern Mediterranean, the pirates became more than criminals. They became a shadow navy, feeding on every weakness left by collapsing kingdoms and distracted empires. Caesar's captivity revealed just how bold they had become. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, Caesar reportedly laughed and told them to ask for 50 because they did not understand his value. For weeks he lived among them as a prisoner who acted like a commander. He joined their games, criticized their speeches, ordered silence when he slept, and warned them that after his release he would return and have them executed. The pirates treated it as arrogance. But once the ransom was paid, Caesar raised ships from nearby cities, pursued them, captured them, and carried out the punishment he had promised. Yet, Caesar's revenge did not end the Cilician threat. The Confederacy had grown too large, too profitable, and too deeply rooted. By the late Republic, piracy was choking Rome's grain supply and spreading fear across the sea lanes. Ships avoided entire routes. Coastal towns prepared for raids. Even sacred temples were not always safe. Rome could conquer provinces on land, but at sea, power became unstable. A pirate fleet needed no capital to defend. It needed only water, speed, and a coastline full of hiding places. In 67 BCE, Rome finally gave Pompey extraordinary command to destroy the pirate network. The campaign was massive, fast, and ruthless. The Mediterranean was divided into zones. Warships swept from west to east. Bases were attacked, ships captured, and many pirates were killed or resettled inland. Officially, Rome had restored order. But the scale of the campaign exposed an uncomfortable truth. The world's rising superpower had needed emergency powers to defeat men who had no kingdom. The Cilician Pirates were not remembered because they stole from ships. They were remembered because they revealed a weakness in empire itself. Rome could build roads, raise legions, and command cities, but the sea remained harder to rule than any province. On land, power could be measured by walls and armies. At sea, it belonged to those who could appear without warning and vanish without a trace. If a young Caesar could be captured in open water, then no Roman was truly untouchable. And if Rome needed a military revolution to crush Cilicia, the question remains colder than the waves themselves. How many empires only looked invincible because their enemies had not yet learned to fight from the sea? Illyrian Pirates. In 230 BCE, along the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea, Roman merchants began returning with stories that sounded less like ordinary piracy and more like a coordinated maritime siege. Ships carrying wine, grain, timber, and silver were being intercepted near the Illyrian coast, not by isolated thieves, but by fast armed flotillas that emerged from island channels and vanished into rocky harbors before any pursuit could begin. The attacks were so frequent that trade across the Adriatic became a gamble. Rome could tolerate robbery. What Rome could not tolerate was the possibility that an entire coastline had become a weapon. The Illyrian Pirates were not built around massive warships. Their strength came from the lembus, a narrow, light, highly maneuverable vessel designed for speed and surprise. Unlike heavier Roman ships, a lembus could hug the coast, slip through shallow waters, and scatter among islands where deep-keeled vessels struggled to follow. These ships were often packed with armed men who needed only a short burst of violence to take control of a merchant vessel. They did not have to win long naval battles. They only had to strike first, seize quickly, and disappear into terrain that favored them. The Adriatic was their perfect hunting ground. Its eastern coast was broken into islands, reefs, channels, and concealed anchorages. From the deck of a merchant ship, the shoreline looked beautiful, even peaceful. But behind that beauty was a maze. A sail could vanish behind one island and reappear behind another. Smoke from a hidden camp could be mistaken for a fishing village. A friendly harbor could become a trap once oars entered the water behind the victim. In this world, maps did not guarantee safety. Local knowledge was more powerful than imperial command. The Illyrian kingdom under Queen Tuta became closely associated with this crisis. Ancient accounts describe her rule as one in which piracy expanded with frightening confidence. Whether Tuta directly ordered every raid is impossible to prove, but Rome viewed the situation as intolerable. When Roman envoys protested the attacks, the response they received was remembered as open defiance. According to later Roman tradition, Tuta argued that Illyrian custom did not forbid private men from taking prizes at sea. To Rome, this was not an explanation. It was an admission that the sea lanes could not be protected by diplomacy. Then the dispute turned deadly. One Roman envoy was killed after the meeting, and Rome had the justification it needed. In 229 BCE, Roman forces crossed the Adriatic and launched what became the First Illyrian War. It was one of Rome's first major military interventions across that sea, and it marked a turning point. Piracy had forced Rome to think beyond Italy. The Illyrian flotillas had done something few enemies had done before. They had pulled Roman power outward, across the water, into a conflict shaped not by conquest alone, but by the need to secure commerce. The campaign weakened Illyrian control and restricted Tuta's power, but the deeper lesson was more disturbing. The pirates had exposed a blind spot in Roman strength. A legion could march through valleys, besiege cities, and break armies in formation. But a pirate fleet did not stand still. It had no single battlefield. It survived through motion, concealment, and the ability to turn geography into armor. After the war, Rome claimed order had been restored. Yet the Adriatic never became simple. More campaigns would follow. More Illyrian resistance would rise. The sea had taught Rome that victory over pirates was never as clean as victory over a city. A city could surrender. A pirate route could only shift. The Illyrian lembus fleets were terrifying because they made empire look slow. They proved that a small ship in the right waters could threaten a power far larger than itself. And behind every Roman intervention lay the same uneasy truth. The Adriatic did not belong to the strongest army. It belonged to those who knew where to hide when the army arrived. Cretan Pirates. In the 2nd century BCE, merchant captains crossing the eastern Mediterranean began treating the waters around Crete with the caution normally reserved for storms. The island stood between Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Levant, placed like a stone knife across the main arteries of ancient trade. Ships carrying grain, bronze, wine, oil, textiles, incense, and slaves had to pass near its reach. For peaceful sailors, Crete was a landmark. For pirates, it was something far more valuable. It was a fortress that floated in the center of the sea. The pirates of Crete did not depend on one port, one king, or one banner. That was what made them dangerous. The island was filled with rugged mountains, hidden bays, narrow beaches, and coastal settlements that could serve as shelters, markets, or repair stations. A raiding vessel could leave at dusk, strike a merchant ship by dawn, and return to a different harbor before news of the attack reached the nearest authority. Larger navies could patrol the open water, but they could not easily search every inlet carved into the Cretan coast. The island itself became an accomplice. Cretan piracy grew in a world where power was fragmented. After the great Hellenistic kingdoms began fighting each other for influence, the sea became crowded with warships, mercenaries, merchants, and displaced fighters. In that confusion, pirates found opportunity. Some Cretan crews acted as raiders. Others worked as hired sailors, scouts, or private attackers for states that wanted damage done without accepting responsibility. This blurred the line between piracy and policy. A ship condemned as criminal by one kingdom could be quietly useful to another. Their tactics were practical and brutal. A merchant vessel heavy with cargo moved slowly, especially when loaded with amphorae, grain sacks, or metal ingots. Pirate ships were lighter and faster. They could approach from behind headlands or shadow a target from a distance until the wind weakened. Once close, the attackers aimed to board quickly. The goal was not a glorious naval battle. It was control. Crewmen could be killed, chained, or held for ransom. Passengers with noble names became living treasure. Cargo was divided, hidden, and moved through networks that made stolen goods hard to trace. Crete's reputation became so severe that it attracted the attention of major powers. Rhodes, one of the strongest naval states in the eastern Mediterranean, struggled repeatedly against piracy that threatened commercial traffic. Rome, increasingly dependent on secure grain routes and maritime order, could not ignore the problem forever. By the 1st century BCE, Cretan pirates had become part of the larger crisis that was turning the Mediterranean into a sea of fear. The island's harbors were no longer only local concerns. They were pressure points in an imperial system. When Rome finally moved against Crete, the campaign was not just punishment for theft. It was an attempt to break the infrastructure behind maritime disorder. To destroy a pirate fleet, ships had to be captured. To destroy pirate power, bases had to be taken, alliances broken, markets disrupted, and coastal protection removed. Crete showed Rome that piracy was not merely an act, it was an ecosystem. What made the Cretan havens unsettling was their normality. These were not ghost islands or legendary lairs beyond the known world. They were real communities woven into trade, politics, and survival. Stolen cargo could pass into ordinary markets. Captives could disappear into ordinary transactions. A harbor that welcomed fishermen in the morning could hide raiders at night. The Cretan pirate havens revealed a darker truth about the ancient sea. Piracy did not survive only because law was absent. It survived because too many people benefited from looking away. And when an island becomes rich from the fear of passing ships, the most dangerous question is not where the pirates are hiding. It is how many doors remain open for them when they return. Aegean Raiders. In the 5th century BCE, when Greek merchant ships crossed the Aegean Sea between Athens, Rhodes, Chios, Samos, and the coast of Asia Minor, every island on the horizon carried two meanings. It could be shelter, or it could be a trap. A captain might see white cliffs, fishing smoke, and the outline of a small harbor, believing safety was near. But behind the rocks, oars could already be moving. In the Aegean, piracy did not always come from the open sea. Sometimes it waited inside the very geography that sailors trusted. The Aegean was not a single open highway. It was a maze of islands, channels, reefs, coves, and narrow passages. This made it one of the most difficult maritime regions in the ancient world to police. A warship could patrol a main route and still miss a raiding vessel hidden behind a low island. A merchant ship could alter course to avoid one danger and sail directly into another. The sea itself created blind spots. For Aegean pirates, those blind spots were not obstacles, they were territory. Unlike the Cilician Confederacy or the Cretan havens, the Aegean Raiders were often fragmented. Some were small island groups, some were displaced sailors, some were mercenaries between wars. Others were communities that shifted between fishing, trading, smuggling, and raiding, depending on the season. That made them extremely hard to define and even harder to eliminate. A man who appeared as a merchant in one port could become a pirate by nightfall, then return days later with stolen cargo, disguised as legitimate trade. Their targets were chosen with precision. Ships carrying olive oil, wine, pottery, silver, grain, dyed cloth, and religious offerings moved constantly between the islands and city-states. Many were not heavily defended. A merchant vessel depended on wind, cargo weight, and predictable routes. A pirate boat could rely on oars, speed, and surprise. If the wind died, the merchant became vulnerable. If the ship hugged the coast for safety, it moved closer to hidden attackers. If it sailed far into open water, it risked isolation. There was no perfect choice. The fear was not only economic. In the Greek world, sea travel connected politics, religion, and family alliances. Envoys crossed the islands, pilgrims sailed to sanctuaries. Young aristocrats traveled for education, diplomacy, or marriage arrangements. A pirate attack could therefore become more than theft. It could disrupt treaties, delay tribute, interrupt festivals, or turn noble passengers into bargaining pieces. A single abduction might pull an entire city into negotiation. Ancient communities responded with patrols, treaties, naval alliances, and occasional punitive expeditions. Athens, Rhodes, and other naval powers understood that control of the sea meant more than winning battles against enemy fleets. It meant keeping everyday movement alive. But the Aegean made complete control almost impossible. For every island watched, another remained unguarded. For every harbor searched, another cove stayed silent. The raiders did not need to defeat the great navies. They only needed to survive between them. This is what made the Aegean island raiders so unsettling. They existed in the gaps between city-states, in the gray space where law depended on distance. On land, a wall could define ownership. At sea, ownership dissolved with the tide. Athenian power might dominate one route, Rhodian ships might guard another, but no authority could watch every sail moving through the island labyrinth. The Aegean raiders turned geography into uncertainty. They made the familiar sea feel haunted, not by spirits, but by human patience, hidden oars, and the knowledge that danger could be waiting behind any beautiful shore. If the islands were the stepping stones of Greek civilization, they were also the hiding places of those who fed on it. And in that maze, the question was never simply where the pirates were. The real question was how many islands had already learned to live with them. Tyrrhenian Pirates. In the centuries before Rome turned the Mediterranean into what it called its own sea, the waters along the western coast of Italy carried a darker reputation. Between Etruria, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Greek colonies of southern Italy, ships moved through a corridor rich with trade and exposed to sudden violence. Merchants carried wine, grain, metalwork, ceramics, timber, and human captives. Colonists crossed to build new settlements. Envoys traveled between rival cities. But somewhere beyond the headlands and island shadows, Tyrrhenian pirate fleets waited for the moment when distance became weakness. The Tyrrhenian Sea was dangerous because it sat at the meeting point of worlds. Etruscan power, Greek colonies, Phoenician trade, and early Roman ambition all pressed against one another across the same waters. In such a crowded maritime zone, piracy could hide behind politics. A raid might look like criminal theft to one city and unofficial warfare to another. A captured cargo might be condemned in public, then quietly sold through a friendly port. The pirate was not always separate from the system. Sometimes he was the system's hidden hand. Ancient Greek tradition remembered Tyrrhenian pirates with unusual fear. In one famous myth, sailors seized the god Dionysus, mistaking him for a noble youth who could be sold for ransom. As the story unfolds, vines spread across the ship, wine flowed over the deck, and the terrified pirates were transformed into dolphins. The tale was myth, not naval record. But myths preserve emotional truth. The Greeks did not choose harmless fishermen as villains in such a story. They chose Tyrrhenian pirates because the name already carried dread. Behind the legend was a real maritime danger. Tyrrhenian raiders knew how to use islands as shields and narrow passages as traps. Sardinia and Corsica provided places to resupply, disappear, and intercept ships moving between Italy and the western Mediterranean. The coasts were broken enough to conceal light vessels, yet close enough to major routes to make attacks profitable. A merchant captain did not need to sail into unknown seas to be vulnerable. He could be within reach of Italy itself and still find no protection. Their methods were direct. They approached when a target was isolated, when winds slowed a sail, or when night concealed their movement. A cargo ship overloaded with amphorae or timber could not maneuver quickly. Once boarded, the outcome was usually decided in some moments. Goods were stripped, crewmen were killed, chained, or taken for ransom. Passengers with status were separated from ordinary sailors. In the ancient world, a person could become cargo as quickly as a jar of wine. The response from established powers was uneven. Greek cities launched naval actions when their commerce suffered. Etruscan and local Italian forces fought, tolerated, or used raiders depending on political need. Later, as Rome expanded, the presence of piracy near Italian waters became increasingly intolerable. It challenged not just trade, but pride. A rising power could not claim mastery of the peninsula while ships near its own coast were being hunted. Yet the Tyrrhenian Pirates were difficult to erase because they existed inside a web of rivalries. As long as cities fought each other, pirates could survive in the spaces between them. They could sell information, disrupt enemies, transport illegal goods, and serve as deniable violence. Their real power was not only at sea, it was in the willingness of land powers to use sea criminals when convenient, then condemn them when the danger turned inward. That is what makes the Tyrrhenian fleet so disturbing. Their memory sits halfway between history and myth because the fear they created was larger than any single record. They were not merely men with ships. They were a warning that civilization's bright coastal cities cast long shadows across the water. If a pirate could become a monster in myth, perhaps the ancients were not exaggerating. Perhaps they were admitting that some fears at sea were too old, too common, and too humiliating to record as ordinary history. Ligurian Corsairs. In the 2nd century BCE, along the harsh northwestern coast of Italy, Roman and Greek merchant ships began avoiding certain stretches of water, not because of storms, but because of the people living above the cliffs. The Ligurian coast was not a gentle shoreline. It was steep, broken, and difficult, a place where mountains seemed to press directly into the sea. Small settlements clung to ridges and hidden coves, paths twisted through stone and scrub. From those heights, watchers could see ships long before the ships could see them. For traders moving between Massalia, Etruria, Corsica, Sardinia, and the western Mediterranean, this coast became a corridor of suspicion. The Ligurian Corsair clans were not a single empire, nor a grand confederacy like the Cilician Pirates. Their danger came from fragmentation. They were coastal communities, tribal groups, and maritime fighters whose lives were shaped by poverty, geography, and war. Some farmed hard land, some traded, some fought as mercenaries, some turned to raiding when opportunity appeared. That fluid identity made them difficult to classify and almost impossible to eliminate. A man could be a shepherd in the hills, a sailor in summer, and a corsair when a merchant ship drifted too close. Their vessels were smaller than the heavy ships of formal navies, but that was precisely the point. They did not need to dominate open water. They needed to know when to strike. A light boat could be dragged into a concealed inlet, hidden beneath cliff shadows, or launched quickly when a lookout signaled from above. To a passing merchant crew, the coastline might appear empty, but in the ancient sea, emptiness was often the most dangerous sign. It meant the attackers had already learned to remain unseen. The Ligurian Corsairs targeted ships that moved along predictable coastal routes. Traders preferred to stay near land for navigation and emergency anchorage, but that habit placed them within reach of ambush. A cargo ship heavy with wine jars, metal goods, salt fish, or grain could not easily flee. If the wind weakened, the ship became almost helpless against oared raiders. Once the Corsairs closed in, the attack was sudden and physical. Hooks caught railings, armed men climbed aboard. Resistance was answered with blades, clubs, and the certainty that no city wall could help a sailor miles from shore. Rome eventually understood that Ligurian raiding was not just a coastal irritation. It threatened movement, settlement, and military supply in the western Mediterranean. Roman campaigns against Ligurian groups were brutal and repeated, fought not only on the water but also in the mountains. This was the difficulty. To stop the pirates, Rome had to fight the coast that produced them. Ships could be burned, but the clans could retreat inland. Villages could be punished, but survivors could return to the coves. The pirate was not separate from the landscape. He was part of it. The campaign against Ligurian piracy also revealed something uncomfortable about Roman expansion. Rome called it pacification. The clans likely saw it as survival against a power moving into their world. In that gray zone, the label of pirate became a political weapon. Those who resisted Roman order at sea were criminals. Those who served Rome in similar ways could become allies, scouts, or auxiliaries. The difference was often not the act itself, but who benefited from it. What makes the Ligurian Corsair clans so compelling is that they were not terrifying because they were large. They were terrifying because they were hard to finish. No single battle could erase them. No captured leader could collapse the entire network. Their strength lived in family ties, hidden coves, mountain paths, and the knowledge that every imperial patrol eventually had to leave. The Ligurian coast turned piracy into a form of terrain warfare. It showed that a fleet did not need great numbers to frighten the sea. Sometimes all it needed was a cliff, a signal fire, a narrow boat, and a captain who realized too late that the shore had been watching him all along. Phoenician Raiders. In the 8th century BCE, across the blue corridors between Tyre, Sidon, Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, and Iberia, Phoenician ships became symbols of wealth, distance, and maritime genius. Their purple dye, glassware, timber, metalwork, and luxury goods moved through ports that connected kingdoms, separated by hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. To many ancient cities, a Phoenician sail meant trade had arrived. But in the darker spaces between official harbors, another reputation followed some of these vessels. Not every ship came only to sell. Some came to take. This part must be handled with care. The Phoenicians were among the greatest seafarers and traders of the ancient world, not simply pirates. Their cities built networks that shaped Mediterranean commerce for centuries. But in the ancient sea, commerce and violence often traveled together. A merchant ship could carry legitimate cargo one season and stolen captives the next. A trader who knew every coast, every market, and every language also knew where people could be seized, transported, and sold. In that world, the line between trade and raiding was not always a wall. Sometimes it was only a change of intention. The most disturbing element was the slave trade. Ancient economies depended heavily on human bondage, and the sea made people movable property. A captured fisherman, a child of a defeated village, a servant from a coastal estate, or a traveler taken from a poorly defended shore could vanish into the holds of ships and reappear in a market far from home. Once sold under another name, the person became almost impossible to trace. The ocean erased identity more efficiently than any battlefield. Phoenician maritime networks made such movement possible because they were vast and efficient. Ships moved between island stations, colonial settlements, and trading posts along North Africa, Sardinia, Sicily, Cyprus, and the Western Mediterranean. Goods could be exchanged through layers of intermediaries. A stolen person did not need to be sold where he or she was taken. Captives could be moved through several ports before reaching a final buyer. Each transfer blurred the origin. Each harbor added silence. Ancient sources sometimes accused Phoenician or Phoenician connected traders of kidnapping, especially in Greek memory, where stories of foreign merchants stealing women or children became part of larger cultural suspicion. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated by rivalry, ethnic fear, or political propaganda, but the persistence of the accusation reveals something important. Coastal communities believed that the danger was real enough to remember. A ship arriving from far away was not always seen as opportunity. Sometimes it was seen as a mouth opening from the sea. Their methods would not have required great fleets in the style of open naval war. A few fast vessels, a trusted coastal contact, and knowledge of market demand could be enough. Raiders might strike isolated beaches, small fishing settlements, or ships with weak crews. The goal was not always to destroy. It was to acquire living cargo without drawing the attention of stronger authorities. A burning town left witnesses and revenge. A silent disappearance left only questions. This is what makes the Phoenician slave raider theme so unsettling for a detective-style narrative. The horror is not only in the attack, it is in the system that could absorb the victims afterward. Pirates who stole gold had to hide the gold. Raiders who stole people could hide them inside ordinary commerce. The crime became harder to see because it wore the face of business. For the empires and kingdoms of the ancient Mediterranean, this created a problem far deeper than piracy. How does a state punish sea raiding when its own markets profit from the captives? How does a city condemn kidnapping while still buying labor from distant ports? The pirate was easy to denounce when he attacked a friendly ship. He was much harder to confront when his stolen cargo arrived as useful property. The Phoenician slave raiders represent the darkest gray zone of ancient maritime power. They showed that the sea did not merely carry goods. It carried secrets, vanished names, and lives converted into profit before anyone on land could ask where they had gone. And if the ancient world's wealth was partly built on people taken from unguarded shores, then the real mystery is not why pirates existed. It is why so many ports were willing to receive what the sea had stolen. Heniochi Pirates. In the 1st century BCE, along the eastern edge of the Black Sea, Greek merchants sailing near the Caucasus coast began speaking of a danger unlike the pirates of the Mediterranean islands. These raiders did not wait near bright harbors or familiar trade routes. They came from a colder, rougher world of forested mountains, violent surf, narrow beaches, and rivers that cut through the land like escape tunnels. Ancient writers place them among the peoples of the eastern Pontus, especially the Heniochi, whose name became attached to a form of piracy that terrified sailors traveling between Greek colonies, Anatolian ports, and the distant markets of the Black Sea. The Black Sea was already a difficult body of water. Unlike the Mediterranean, it could turn hostile with little warning. Storms rose fast, safe harbors were unevenly spaced. The coastline near the Caucasus offered few places where a large merchant ship could easily defend itself. For the Heniochi Pirates, this was ideal. Their world did not require huge fleets or monumental ports. It required small vessels, local knowledge, and the ability to appear from land that outsiders barely understood. Ancient descriptions speak of light boats used by these coastal raiders, vessels small enough to be pulled ashore and concealed among trees or rocks. That detail matters. A formal navy looks for ships in water, but a pirate boat that could vanish into the landscape became something more elusive. After an attack, the raiders did not need to outrun every pursuer across open sea. They could beach the craft, drag supplies inland, scatter into mountain settlements, and leave nothing behind but broken cargo and dead sailors. Their targets were the ships that fed the Black Sea economy. Greek colonies depended on grain, fish, timber, metal, slaves, wax, honey, and luxury goods moving through these waters. Merchant captains followed coastal routes because open water was dangerous, but the coast brought them within reach of ambush. A ship slowing near a river mouth or seeking shelter from bad weather could suddenly find itself surrounded by narrow boats filled with armed men. The attack would be fast, close, and brutal. There was little room for negotiation when the nearest friendly city lay many miles away. What made the Heniochi frightening was not only the raid itself, but the disappearance afterward. Mediterranean pirates often needed markets, ports, and ransom channels that could eventually be traced. The eastern Black Sea raiders had mountains behind them. Captives could be moved inland. Stolen cargo could be broken apart, traded through tribal networks, or carried into regions where Greek and Roman officials had almost no reach. The crime dissolved into geography. For Greek cities around the Black Sea, this created a constant security problem. They could build walls around settlements, but walls did not protect ships between ports. They could hire escorts, but escorts were expensive and never enough. They could send complaints to larger powers, but distance weakened every response. Later, Roman influence reached into the region, yet even Roman authority struggled against coastal raiding that did not depend on fixed bases. A Roman commander could punish a town. He could not punish every cove, ravine, and forest path. The Heniochi Pirates show a different face of ancient piracy. They were not glamorous sea kings or legendary kidnappers of nobles. They were predators of the frontier, born from a coastline where empire arrived thin, late, and uncertain. Their power came from being underestimated. To the great cities of the south, the Black Sea was a trade zone. To the Heniochi Raiders, it was a hunting ground bordered by a wilderness that swallowed evidence. This is why their story belongs in the darker archive of ancient maritime history. They reveal that piracy was not only a Mediterranean problem and not only a crime of crowded ports. It could thrive wherever commerce passed near land that no empire truly controlled. If the Cilicians proved that pirates could challenge Rome in the heart of the Mediterranean, the Heniochi proved something even colder. At the edge of the known world, the sea did not need a pirate kingdom to become terrifying. It only needed a coast where attackers could strike from the water, vanish into the trees, and leave the empire staring at an empty shore. Taurian Raiders. In the 5th century BCE, Greek sailors entering the northern Black Sea carried more than cargo in their holds. They carried warnings. Beyond the familiar harbors of the Aegean and the trading colonies along the Pontic coast, there was a region spoken of with unease, a harsh peninsula of cliffs, wind, and jagged shoreline, known to the Greeks as Taurus. Today, it is associated with Crimea. In the ancient imagination, it was something darker. It was a place where ships could disappear against the rocks, where foreign sailors could be captured after wrecks, and where the boundary between piracy, ritual, and frontier violence became almost impossible to separate. The Taurian coast was not built for comfort. Steep headlands fell into cold water. Sudden storms drove vessels toward dangerous shorelines. Hidden coves offered shelter to those who knew them, but death to those who did not. Merchant ships traveling between Greek colonies such as Chersonesus, Olbia, and the rich grain routes of the northern Black Sea had to pass through waters that felt far from the protection of Athens, Rhodes, or Rome. Here, a sailor could not assume that a distant fire meant welcome. It might be a signal, it might be bait. Ancient Greek writers described the Taurians as fierce coastal people who preyed on strangers and shipwrecked crews. Some accounts are wrapped in myth, especially the story of Iphigenia in Taurus, where foreigners brought to the land were sacrificed to Artemis. The details belong to tragedy and religion, not straightforward naval records. But myths often grow from fear attached to real places. The Greeks remembered Taurus as a shoreline where outsiders were not safe. That reputation alone tells us that something about the region disturbed generations of sailors. The raiders of Taurus did not need to control open sea routes like the Cilicians or organize island networks like the Aegean Pirates. Their advantage was local dominance over a deadly coast. A storm-damaged ship could be watched from the cliffs. Survivors reaching the shore could be captured before they understood where they had landed. Cargo scattered along beaches could be seized. A vessel anchored too close to land might be attacked by small boats under cover of darkness. In such conditions, piracy did not always look like a chase. Sometimes it looked like waiting. What makes the Taurian Raiders especially unsettling is how closely their piracy was tied to geography and reputation. A pirate fleet in the Mediterranean might be judged by the number of ships it seized. Taurus was judged by the silence surrounding those who never returned. A missing merchant vessel could be blamed on weather. A lost crew could be blamed on rocks. A vanished passenger could become another rumor folded into the old stories of the peninsula. The coast itself became the accomplice, making every crime difficult to prove. Greek colonies in the Black Sea lived with this danger for centuries. They depended on trade with surrounding peoples, but also feared the instability of the frontier. Grain, fish, slaves, metals, and hatsades moved through the region, creating wealth worth stealing. The same sea that fed the colonies exposed them. Every expansion of commerce pushed more ships into waters where imperial law was thin and local power was immediate. A city could fortify its harbor, but it could not fortify every mile of coast between ports. Later powers would attempt to bring order to the Black Sea, but Taurus remained difficult because it was not merely a pirate base. It was a frontier zone, a place where the categories of civilized and barbarian, trader and raider, survivor and captive all broke down. To the Greeks, it became a warning written into legend. To sailors, it was a coastline that demanded distance. The Taurian Crimea raiders terrified the ancient sea not because they ruled a vast fleet, but because they turned arrival itself into danger. To reach shore was supposed to mean survival. Along Taurus, shore could mean capture, disappearance, or a fate transformed into myth. And that is the darkest question left by those waters. How many ancient pirate stories were not born from battles at sea, but from ships that reached land and were never heard from again? Red Sea Raiders? In the 2nd century BCE, along the narrow waters of the Red Sea, ships sailing between Egypt, Arabia, and the distant ports of India began facing a threat that did not come from open ocean storms. It came from the coast. Merchant vessels carrying incense, myrrh, spices, ivory, pearls, textiles, glassware, and precious metals moved through a corridor so valuable that every harbor, reef, and desert inlet became a potential point of ambush. To the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, the Red Sea was not just water. It was the eastern artery of wealth. But to raiders operating along its shores, that artery could be cut. The Nabatean world is usually remembered for caravans, desert trade, and the rose-colored stone city of Petra. Yet their position between Arabia, the Levant, and the Red Sea placed them near one of the richest exchange systems of antiquity. Not every Nabatean sailor was a pirate, and not every attack in the region can be assigned with certainty to one people. But ancient powers did accuse groups connected to the Arabian and Nabatean coast of raiding ships. Disrupting maritime traffic and threatening the sea lanes that connected Egypt to the incense routes. In the politics of empire, the word pirate often meant more than criminal. It meant someone interfering with revenue. The Red Sea created a very different kind of piracy from the Mediterranean. Its waters were narrow, hot, and difficult. Reefs could tear open holes. Winds could trap vessels for days. Fresh water was scarce. Safe anchorages were limited and therefore predictable. A captain who needed to stop for repairs, water, or shelter could not choose freely. He had to approach known points along the coast. That predictability made merchant ships vulnerable. A raiding group did not need to search the entire sea. It only needed to wait near the places where survival forced ships to come close. Their vessels would have been lighter and better suited to coastal movement than the heavy merchant ships they targeted. A loaded transport coming from the south or east might carry cargo worth an enormous fortune, but wealth made it slow. Raiders could strike near dusk from behind reefs or low headlands, using the confusion of shallow water to their advantage. Once close, they could board, strip portable goods, seize passengers, and retreat before a larger patrol vessel could respond. In the Red Sea, distance was cruel. Help was not hours away. It could be days away. For Egypt's rulers, the danger was strategic. The Ptolemies invested in Red Sea ports and routes because Eastern trade brought luxury goods into their kingdom and strengthened their position against rivals. If raiders controlled the approaches, they did not need to conquer a city. They could tax the sea through fear. Every captured ship increased prices. Every delayed voyage weakened confidence. Every missing crew spread rumors through the ports. Piracy became economic warfare without a declared war. The political tension deepened because desert trade and sea trade were connected. Caravans could carry incense north. Ships could carry it across the water. Whoever controlled both land approaches and coastal access could influence the movement of wealth between Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. This made anti-piracy campaigns more complicated. A naval patrol might chase raiders, but the support networks could lead inland, into deserts where foreign armies struggled. The sea crime had roots in land power. This is what makes the Nabatean Red Sea Raiders so intriguing. Their story sits in the shadow between trade, smuggling, coastal warfare, and imperial accusation. Were they pirates in the simple sense, attacking ships for plunder? Were they local powers defending access to routes they believed were theirs? Or were they branded as pirates because they stood between Egypt and the prophets of the East? The Red Sea did not need massive pirate kingdoms to become terrifying. It needed only narrow passages, valuable cargo, and coastline controlled by people who knew the desert as well as the water. In that world, a merchant ship was not merely sailing through a trade route. It was entering a corridor where empire, profit, and survival met under a burning sky. And the most dangerous question remains unresolved. When a kingdom calls a coastal raider a pirate, is it describing a crime, or is it hiding a war over who has the right to control the road of wealth? Indian Ocean Pirates. In the 1st century CE, when merchant ships left the Red Sea and crossed toward the western coast of India, they entered a maritime world far larger and less controllable than the Mediterranean. The journey followed the monsoon winds, powerful seasonal currents that could carry a vessel across hundreds of miles of open water. On board were spices, pearls, ivory, silk, gemstones, aromatics, cotton textiles, glass, silver, and Roman gold. The profits could be enormous, but once a ship moved beyond the familiar harbors of Egypt, Arabia, or India, it also moved beyond the reach of any single empire. The Indian Ocean did not behave like an inland sea. It was vast, seasonal, and psychologically terrifying. A merchant captain could not simply follow a coastline from port to port. Many voyages required long crossings where land disappeared completely. Navigation depended on stars, wind patterns, currents, and inherited knowledge. If a ship was delayed, damaged, or blown off course, the crew might not know whether they were days from safety or drifting toward death. In that emptiness, pirates did not need to control every route. They needed only to know where ships were most vulnerable. Ancient maritime guides described dangerous stretches near Arabia, the Horn of Africa, the Persian Gulf, and western India, where raiders could attack vessels weakened by weather or forced into predictable approaches near ports. Some pirate bands operated from coastal settlements. Others may have used island anchorages, river mouths, or hidden inlets along trade corridors. They were not always large fleets in the formal sense. Their strength was timing. They understood when merchant ships arrived with a monsoon, when cargo holds were full, when crews were exhausted, and when captains had no choice but to approach land for water, repairs, or trade. The targets were irresistible. A single ship returning from India could carry goods worth fortunes in Mediterranean markets. Pepper, cinnamon, beryl, pearls, ivory, and fine cotton were not ordinary cargo. They were luxury goods for elites, temples, palaces, and imperial households. To seize such a vessel was not merely robbery, it was the capture of a floating treasury. Human passengers could be ransomed or sold. Skilled sailors could be forced into service. Cargo could be broken apart and traded through distant markets where its origin became impossible to prove. What made piracy in the ancient Indian Ocean especially difficult to suppress was the scale of the arena. Rome could send fleets into the Mediterranean. Egypt could guard certain Red Sea ports. Indian kingdoms could control coastal zones near their own harbors. Arabian powers could watch their side of the route, but none of them could command the entire ocean. Authority dissolved with distance. A crime committed far from shore could become only a rumor by the time the survivors reached a port. There was also a political shadow behind the violence. Some raiders may have been independent criminals. Others may have been tolerated by local rulers who benefited from stolen goods or used sea raiding to weaken commercial rivals. In a world where customs duties, port access, and foreign trade created enormous wealth, controlling fear could be as useful as controlling law. A ruler did not always need to sponsor piracy openly. Sometimes silence was enough. The ancient Indian Ocean pirate bands reveal a form of terror different from the island raiders of the Aegean or the coastal ambushers of Liguria. Here, the fear came from distance itself. A ship could vanish so far from home that no family, city, or empire would ever know exactly what happened. No battlefield, no wreckage, no official report. Only a missed arrival, an empty berth, and a cargo that appeared months later under another name. In the Indian Ocean, piracy was not just an attack on ships, it was an attack on certainty. Every voyage depended on trust in wind, stars, crew, and distant ports. The pirates poisoned that trust. They turned the richest trade network of the ancient world into a corridor where fortune and disappearance sailed under the same sky. And if a single ocean could carry the wealth of empires beyond the reach of their laws, then perhaps the ancient world was never truly connected by trade. Perhaps it was connected by risk, and every treasure that arrived safely had passed through darkness no record would ever fully reveal. Joppa Pirates. In 67 CE, on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, the port city of Joppa became something more dangerous than a coastal settlement caught in war. As Roman forces pushed through Judea during the First Jewish-Roman War, survivors, rebels, sailors, fugitives, and armed men gathered near the harbor and turned the sea into their last weapon. They did not have the strength to meet Rome in open battle on land. They did not have the walls to withstand a long siege. But they had ships, desperation, and a coastline connected to the trade routes of Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt. From that moment, Joppa became a pirate base born from collapse. The flotilla that emerged from Joppa was different from the older pirate powers of Cilicia or Crete. It was not a centuries-old maritime culture. It was a violent adaptation to disaster. When cities fall and armies scatter, men who once fought under banners often become something harder to categorize. To Rome, they were pirates. To themselves, they may have been survivors continuing the war by other means. Their vessels moved along the coast, attacking passing ships, threatening merchant traffic, and disrupting movement through waters Rome needed to keep secure. Every raid carried a message. Even after Roman victories on land, the sea could still resist. Joppa's geography made the situation volatile. The harbor was not large or perfectly protected, but it offered access to the coastal route linking the Levant to Egypt. Ships moving grain, military supplies, messages, officials, and commercial cargo could not ignore the danger. A small flotilla operating from such a position did not need to defeat Roman naval power in a formal battle. It only needed to make movement uncertain. A merchant captain, hearing that Joppa had become a pirate nest, would think twice before sailing near the coast. A delayed supply ship could affect soldiers. A captured vessel could spread panic faster than any official report. The men of the Joppa flotilla likely relied on fast coastal vessels, sudden boarding actions, and knowledge of local waters. Their attacks would have been close, desperate, and personal. These were not distant bombardments. A pirate raid in that world meant grappling hooks, blades, shouting, broken oars, and bodies thrown into the surf. Cargo was seized quickly. Survivors could be ransomed, recruited, or killed. The line between rebel warfare and piracy blurred with every attack. Rome could not allow that blur to continue. For an empire, naming an enemy matters. A soldier can be negotiated with. A rebel can become part of a political settlement, but a pirate can be exterminated as a threat to order itself. When Vespasian moved against Joppa, the response was severe. The city was attacked, and the sea became the scene of catastrophe. Ancient accounts describe ships caught in violent conditions after Roman pressure forced the defenders toward the water. Men who had tried to survive by turning to the sea were trapped between imperial force and the indifferent violence of nature. The destruction of the Joppa flotilla carried a deeper meaning. Rome was not simply punishing raiders. It was sealing a wound in its authority. A port that became a pirate base during rebellion proved that imperial control was never complete as long as defeated men could still reach ships. Walls could be taken, roads could be patrolled, but a coastline offered escape, transformation, and continued resistance. That is why Joppa makes a powerful final file in the archive of ancient pirate fleets. It shows piracy at its most politically unstable. These were not only criminals seeking wealth, they were the wreckage of war turned outward against the sea lanes of the empire. Their existence forced a difficult question that Rome answered with violence but never truly resolved. When an empire calls a defeated enemy a pirate, is it describing what that enemy has become, or is it choosing the word that makes destruction easier? Conclusion. These ancient pirate fleets reveal a dangerous pattern that empires never liked to admit. The sea was not simply a space between kingdoms. It was a second world, one where borders dissolved, laws weakened, and power belonged to whoever could move faster than authority. From Cilicia to Illyria, from Crete to the Black Sea, from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, piracy survived because ancient states could not control every harbor, every island, every cove, and every ship that vanished beyond the horizon. The most unsettling truth is that pirates were rarely separate from civilization. They fed on trade, but they also depended on it. They attacked merchants, but their stolen goods still entered markets. They captured people, but slave buyers made the crime profitable. They were condemned by kings, yet sometimes used by the same powers as weapons against rivals. Piracy was not always an accident outside the system. Often, it was the system's hidden shadow. That is why these fleets terrified the ancient world. They exposed the weakness of empires that looked unstoppable on land. A legion could crush a city. A king could tax a road. A navy could win a battle, but the sea could not be occupied in the same way. It could only be watched, patrolled, feared, and never fully trusted. The pirates eventually fell, one fleet at a time, but the question they left behind remains. If the strongest empires of antiquity could not fully master the sea, then perhaps their power was never as complete as their monuments claimed. The real mystery is not why pirates rose from the waves. It is why every empire needed so long to understand that the ocean had already chosen different rulers.